All right, so this is the second part of the Great Depression and the Rise of FDR lecture. We did the Great Depression Monday. We got all the way through the election of Franklin Roosevelt, where Roosevelt won his election by basically promising to try anything. He promised Americans a New Deal. And really what that meant was, I'm just going to do whatever I can. I'm going to try anything. I'm going to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And that's what he did. We talked about the 100 days where he closed the banks in order to stop the banks, the runs of the bank. We call that a bank holiday. He insured the money with the FDIC. The first 100 days were all about immediate relief. We always say that the New Deal is about relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is we have to stop the bleeding now. This is first aid. We're just going to get in there. We're going to get the people what they need in order to stop the bleeding on the Great Depression. The second New Deal is more about recovery and reform. And by recovery, we mean now we're going to try and regain some of that stuff that we lost. And reform, we mean we're going to prevent these bad things from ever happening again by putting laws in place. So relief, recovery, and reform. Those have ended up on STAR tests before. So if you need to write that down somewhere and knock yourself out. But the New Deal was focused on relief, recovery, and reform. All right, so the second New Deal. One of the first things it does, in 1935, he pushes through the Social Security Act. Now, if you don't know what the Social Security Act is, it's an old age pension system. Now, it was sold to America as a retirement program. It's not what it is. But that's what it was sold to America as. We were told as Americans, and I say we like I was around, I'm old but I'm not that old. Americans were told that what Social Security was that they were going to take a percentage of your salary out every month. That's what FICA is on your bill. They're going to take that out. They were going to put it in an account with your name on it, let it earn interest, and then when you got to retirement age, which was 55 back then, they would start sending you a monthly check. So basically what they're doing is they told us they're making a savings account for you and protecting it. Now, that's not what happened. What in fact happened was they took that money, and that money immediately turned around and went back out to current retirees. So you had people that were 55 years old that hadn't paid into the system that were collecting. And that works fine as long as you have significantly more workers than you have retirees. We're going to see when we get to the end of this class where Social Security breaks down is when the baby boom starts to retire, and all of a sudden there's the same number of retirees as there are workers. And y'all's generation, where there's going to be more retirees than there are workers by the time y'all are in your 30s and 40s. Okay, how do you function that way? So the Social Security Act was pushed through at this time period, and it was loved. It was something that was greatly appreciated. They also founded the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. And the SEC was there to govern the stock market, not just stocks, bonds, all of your money market accounts, and prevent any future runs on the market, okay? So what they did is they put stop gaps in where if the stock market loses X amount of their value, and I think it's 10% originally is what it was, it loses 10% of its value over a period of so many hours, and I've forgotten exactly how many, the market shuts off automatically. It just quits. And that prevents these big sell-offs. So you've got a day to calm down and cool off, and the next day the sell-off could begin again, but if it loses 10%, it shuts off. So you can't have this situation where 80% of the value of the stock market is gone in a single day. And it's worked. We've had some bad days on the market, but we've never again had a day like October 1929. Okay, so the SEC seems to have taken care of this. So 1936 comes along. FDR and John Nance Garner. John Nance Garner's a Texan, by the way, from Lufkin, Texas, originally. John Nance Garner is the vice president for FDR, and they're running for re-election. And Alfred Landon and Frank Knox was an admiral, Secretary of the Navy by this point, are running as the Republican candidates. And you can see that FDR did quite well. 523 to 8. That is a massive victory. And that shows you how successful people at least believed Roosevelt to be, okay? His relief program seemed to stop the bleeding. Were we still in a depression in 1936? Yes, we were. But we were no longer losing jobs. We were no longer having more people become unemployed. We weren't gaining jobs yet, but things were obviously better than they were, okay? So how did Roosevelt win this election so big? Well, the single biggest answer to that is he captured the black vote. The African American vote began voting Democrat during this time period. It's hard for us to imagine today because we know that statistically the African American vote votes Democrat today. Now, does that mean all African Americans vote Democrat? Absolutely not. There's a lot of Republican African Americans, a lot of libertarians, a lot of Nazis. But the majority of the population tends to vote Democrat. That hasn't always been the case. In fact, until 1936, it was the opposite. They tended to vote Republican because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party that had freed the slaves. How on earth does this New York Yankee capture the black vote? Well, he does it very carefully. First off, he establishes what he calls his black cabinet. This means that for every cabinet level official, he had an African American official that advised him on that level, on how that would be perceived by the black population. So he might have a Secretary of Education, but then he would have a black Secretary of Education or Undersecretary of Education in his black cabinet that would tell him, well, Mr. President, this is the way the black community sees this. So the black community felt like they had a voice. Now, I'll tell you, to me, this is one of the most racist things Roosevelt ever did. If he really cared about racism, he just would have put some of those African Americans in his cabinet. But he didn't do that. He created a black cabinet, a segregated cabinet that's going to advise him. But that is so much better than any president had done since Theodore Roosevelt that it seems to be a big deal. And it gives him a voice. He put this lady on the left, Mary McLeod Bethune, as Undersecretary of Education. A very forward, very front person in his administration. And she was a teacher from Florida, the daughter of slaves, and that shows that there's somebody that has, really come from nothing to be something successful. And she advises the president on problems in the black community, and they start trying to fund black schools a little better. And then he had his secret weapon. That's her there on the right. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife. Eleanor Roosevelt had great credentials with the black community. Yes, she was a wealthy white woman, but she was a founding member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She had long fought for black rights. Since the 19-teens and 20s, she was known to be a big voice for equal rights. So when she put her arm around her husband and said, my husband is going to protect you, the black community believed her. Okay? Yeah, could have been. She's a tough broad. Now, little trivia fact that you'll never see on the STAR test. She didn't have to change her name when she married Roosevelt because they were already cousins. Roosevelt is her maiden name and her married name. She's Theodore Roosevelt's niece. So she was already a second cousin to Franklin Roosevelt when they married. Second cousin, yeah, it's kind of pretty close. But in those circles in those days, you know, the wealthy tended to marry the wealthy, and when money stays inside families, that's what happens. If you want to know what happens if you do that too much, you go look at the royal family in England. You get mutants like King Charles, okay, or Prince Charles. All right, so let's look at how FDR changes at this point. This is the second part of this. We've dealt with FDR as a New Dealer to this point. But now we're going to look at FDR as a wartime president. And it's a little bit different. He's a different Franklin Roosevelt in this second administration. First off, the court is not friendly to Roosevelt. The Supreme Court and Roosevelt had fought a great deal. You don't have to know this slide. I've got it up here because to me it's interesting, but it's later slides that are more important as far as the class goes. But there is a question as to whether the Supreme Court even has the right to rule an act of Congress unconstitutional. Now, if you're a constitutionalist, and I like to think that I am, then ultimately when somebody asks you, can I do something, your answer is always, let's go look at the Constitution and see. Well, if you go look at the Constitution, it doesn't say in it anywhere that the court has the power to rule an act of Congress unconstitutional. In fact, all it says is there will be a Supreme Court and as many undercourts or lower courts as Congress deems necessary. That's it. So, where did they get this power from? Well, you remember back to last semester. We talked about that Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, 1803. That established judicial review. The court just took the power way back in 1803, and they ruled on a situation where Marbury was trying to get an appointment, and Madison didn't want to give it to him. That established it, and then nobody argued with him. And since our system works on precedent, it became the precedent. But if you look at this, between 1787 and 1860, think about that. From the day that our Constitution was founded, all the way up to the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, they had only ruled 2 acts of Congress unconstitutional. It had only been used twice. Why? Because nobody was really sure if it was legal or not. And then between 1860 and 1900, they had ruled 23 laws unconstitutional. That's a big increase. And then between 1900 and 1930, 35 times they had ruled an act of Congress unconstitutional. What we're seeing here is an expanding court. The court is taking more and more power, and they're willing to hear more and more cases, and they're throwing out laws that are passed by a duly elected Congress. Okay? This is the environment that Roosevelt comes into power in, and Roosevelt is trying to do so much. We already know he did more than any president in history did, even in his first 100 days. But now the court's going to go to war with him, and they're going to start undoing it. And to make matters worse, in Roosevelt's first term, he doesn't get to appoint a single Supreme Court justice, because they will not go away. And if you don't know how the Supreme Court works, once you're appointed for life or good behavior. You stay until either you retire, you die, or you get impeached for a crime. Okay? So a president can very easily get stuck with a Supreme Court that was appointed by the other party. That's what Roosevelt got stuck with. I've got a chart up here to show you just how important it is to appoint the right people to the court, okay? We're going to go all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt, okay? And we're going to look at the number of years that presidents served and the number of appointments they had and add it up. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a progressive president, by himself, he served 8 years as president. He actually served closer to 9 because he came into a term. But as a progressive, he gets to make 3 appointments to the court. Taft, who's a conservative, he only serves 4 years. But in those 4 years, he gets to appoint 6 members to the court. Wilson, a progressive, he gets re-elected, so he serves 8 years. He gets to put three people on the court. And then the next 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, serve a total of 12 years. They get to put 8 people on the court. Now, I want you to think about that. In 16 years of conservative leadership and 16 years of progressive leadership, over the last 32 years, there have been 16 years with conservative presidents and 16 years with progressives. But, look at it. The conservatives had appointed 14 members, while the progressives had only appointed 6. America is clearly divided between progressive and conservative, but the court is not. The court is overwhelmingly a conservative court. And they're going to go to war against Roosevelt. That's going to be a mistake, by the way. Roosevelt, we may not like Roosevelt all the time, and I'll be honest, I don't like a lot about Franklin Roosevelt. But if you're a political junkie or if you're somebody that really wants to get involved in politics and you want to learn how to move an argument, win an argument, and stay president, Roosevelt's who you study, okay? What are they going to do? Well, first off, they ruled the National Recovery Act. This is later on going to be called the National Industrial Recovery Act. So sometimes you see this as the NRA and sometimes the NIRA. They're both the same thing, okay? They rule it unconstitutional. Why? Because they said it's unlawful for the president to legislate. The president cannot write laws. And that's what you're doing when you created this. That's the job of the legislature. By the way, I think they were right. The president did exceed his authority. Next, they threw out the Agricultural Adjustment Act for the same reasons. Mr. President, you overreached. You can't do this. If you want this, we'll support you, but you have to go through Congress. You can't just do it by executive order. And then they declared the New York State minimum wage law unconstitutional. Now, that's not a federal law, but that's going to scare Roosevelt because he's getting ready to put a federal minimum wage in. And he doesn't want it overturned. So he looks at it and he goes, I've got to fix this court. I've got to find a way to fix it. So he goes to war with the court. We call this the court packing scheme. It's technically called the court reform plan, but historians always call it the court packing scheme because a scheme sounds better, it sounds dirtier. Now you all may know how many Supreme Court justices we have. We have 9. But what you may not know is the Constitution doesn't say how many Supreme Court justices we have to have. It's up to the president. When Washington was president, we had 1 in his first term, and we ultimately had 3. We had 6 for a while. That didn't work well. We like to keep an odd number. About the time we got to Lincoln's administration, it goes up to the number of 9, and it had stayed at 9 ever since then. So the tradition since 1861, had been 9 judges. But it was just tradition. So what does Roosevelt do? Roosevelt gets Machiavellian. He gets sneaky here. And he tells the American people, our Supreme Court justices are too old. They just can't do the job anymore. Most of these guys are approaching their 70th birthday. So he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help them out. Says, I'm not going to war against the court. I'm trying to help the judges. So what he does is he says, I want the ability to appoint. Hello. I just spilled all over whatever that is.
Yeah, it don't matter.
I want the ability to appoint up to 6 assistant judges for any Supreme Court justice that doesn't retire within 6 months of their 70th birthday. This would have raised the number of Supreme Court justices to 15 by 1935. And it would have given Roosevelt control of the court. Now, is what he's asking illegal? No, not at all. He can do this. But if he does, he's using a lot of political capital. The American public does not support this. They are very much against the idea of Roosevelt packing the court. They see it as a violation of separation of power. The court feels threatened, Congress feels threatened, and the people rise up and say, Mr. President, you can't do this. Now, I'll tell you, your textbook says that this was Roosevelt's one misstep, his only political mistake, because he loses this battle. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. I think the people that write your textbook are wrong. Because they're not political animals, they're historians. And I am both a historian and a political animal. And I am telling you that Roosevelt did not make a mistake here. He did not misstep. Roosevelt did a trick that you're all familiar with. You've all done this, I know, because I'm a parent, and I was a kid once upon a time. You want to do something that you know your parents aren't going to let you do. You really want them to. Do you ask to do that, or do you ask to do something a lot bigger? My son used to do this. If he wanted to stay out later after curfew, it's something. He would stay out after midnight. Because I'm a mean old man, I made him be home by midnight. He'd say, Dad, can I stay out till 6 in the morning? No, you're not staying out till 6 in the morning. But I'll tell you what, I'll let you stay out till 1. That's what he wanted to begin with. He asked for too much. Okay? I think that's what Roosevelt did here. He asked for this ridiculous stuff. He scares the crud out of the court system. He scares the crud out of Congress. And while he doesn't get this, he does end up getting what he wants. Because in fact, the court reformed itself. Roosevelt didn't have to do this. Look at it. The two biggest conservatives on the court, Justice Hughes and Justice Roberts, they change how they vote and they start voting progressive. They start voting the way Roosevelt wants them to. Van Devanter, that's him at the far right, that Roosevelt could not stand. Van Devanter, he just retires. He says, I'm tired of dealing with you, Roosevelt. He retires and leaves an opening. And in the next 4 years, Roosevelt gets to appoint 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Now, did Roosevelt overreach with his threat? No, he didn't overreach. Roosevelt outsmarted him. That's my opinion. Again, your textbook says he overreached and he lost. Does that look like a loss to you? He got to appoint 7 of the Supreme Court justices. It looks like I'd take a victory lap if I'm the president. (1937). This was the year that could have taken out Roosevelt. I want you to realize that in 1937, what was going on in the world? Adolf Hitler had consolidated power in Germany, and they'd done it through what they called the Night of the Long Knives, where Nazis marched out, and in the dark of night, they killed their enemies. People just got strangled in bed. It's called the purge. Stalin Stalin was doing the same thing in Russia. Mussolini was consolidating his power in Italy. And amongst all this, you see what's happening as people are consolidating power. And in the U.S., FDR is consolidating power. Do you think people are going to be scared? Yeah. There are people that see comparisons. And a lot of conservatives want to stop this progressive movement because, honestly, if you take progressivism to its farthest extreme, what do you get? You get communism. Okay? Just like if you take conservatism to its farthest extreme, you get fascism. They're mirror images of each other. And people see Roosevelt as being so progressive that he is bordering on being communist. So these group of conservative Democrats start voting with the Republicans to try and stop it. And part of the reason is, remember, Roosevelt's already ran twice. No president had ever sought a third term. So Vice President John Nance Garner wants to separate himself from Franklin Roosevelt because he's planning on running for president this next time. He expects FDR to step down and he'll get the nod for the Democratic Party. This is John Nance Garner. By the way, for my students in Wales, if that guy looks familiar to you at all, that's because that's a cousin of Mr. C.W. They look a lot alike, don't they? The distant cousin. He's from Lufkin. I've forgotten how they were related. C.W. told me one time about it. So he's a cousin of yours too, then, isn't he, Jackson? Yes. Yes.
I'm kin to the Williams.
Does look like it, doesn't it?
It really
It really
does.
does.
So he believes FDR will not seek a third term.
You're wrong.
He's wrong. So he's going to lead the opposition to some of FDR's bills. Now, FDR is not going to put up with that. FDR is going to be furious. And he's going to start purging the Democratic Party of anybody that's against him. Now, you want to talk about somebody that builds a political machine? Tyler, you'll appreciate this one. FDR is the first president to campaign in states for congressional seats. It never happened before. But he shows up. If you were loyal to him, he showed up, he flew his plane in, he made a boatload of noise, and he put his arm around you and said, vote for this guy. FDR's popular. It worked. If you went against him, he flew his plane into your town, picked some poor district attorney out of the crowd, and said, vote for this guy instead, and he unseated you. FDR actually ran people against sitting Democrats if they didn't support him. He ran a political machine. He calls this purging, and the people that he's against are called copperheads. Copperheads are disloyal Democrats. By the way, that term goes all the way back to the Civil War. It's what Abraham Lincoln called the Southerners that are the rebels that went against the Union were copperheads. So Southerners don't like this. It does not play well in the South because we don't like when the federal government interferes in our state elections. We saw this as violating states' rights. And you know what? We seceded over states' rights once before. We might do it again. We didn't like it. In the North, they loved it. The North, they ate it up. As a result, in the midterm elections of 1938, the Republicans actually win big. Now, this shouldn't be surprising. Some people look at this and they go, FDR overreached, he lost seats for his own party. Well, he probably did overreach. But let's remember that in the 20th century, only one president has ever picked up seats in a midterm election for his party. And that's George W. Bush. Okay? It doesn't happen. You lose seats in midterm elections. But the Republicans won big. They picked up 81 House seats, 8 Senate seats, and 13 governorships. And they're all up north. Okay? All right, we're going to shift for a minute into a world history class. And it's going to seem weird because we're going to be talking about like Japan and Germany and Italy and all kinds of stuff. But The reason why is because we're getting into World War II, and frankly, you can't get into World War II if you don't understand why World War II happened, okay? So let's look at things a little bit. How did World War II start? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on, and let's remember the U.S. got into it very late. We're always late getting into wars. We get into war just in time to win it, okay? But Japan and China have a weird relationship where they've always kind of depended on each other and coalesced together, but they don't like each other, okay? The Japanese have to have China to sell goods to, and they have to have China to buy goods from. And China kind of has to have Japan as a market as well. Well, Japan starts using this new term, the Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. What does that sound like? Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Sounds like they're saying they're better than.
You're close. What they're saying is all of Asia should be united so we're all prosperous together. Well, by being united, what they mean is we should be ruling you, okay? Particularly China. So what are they going to do? They need an excuse. You have to have an excuse to go to war. You don't just go to war. Unless you're a madman like Hitler. You don't just go to war. You need an excuse. So what they did is there was this train that went from the coast up into Manchuria, and it brought supplies back and forth between Japan and the Chinese. And the Japanese claimed that the Chinese blew the bridge up to prevent supplies from coming in, and they said that the people of Manchuria were starving to death without Japanese supplies. So they had to go in as a peacekeeping force to save the starving Manchurians. So they rode the train in, and they got off the train, and hold up. Did y'all catch that?
They rode the train.
They rode the train in. But why did they have to come in? What did the Chinese do? The Chinese blew up the train so they couldn't come in. Now, hold up. How do you come in on a train if the tracks have been blown up? Well, you don't. What happened was the Japanese brought all their men in on the train. And when they crossed the bridge, the Japanese blew the bridge up behind them, blamed the Chinese, and said, "We're here to save you." They made it up. This is a picture of where the bombs were at and stuff. But they come into Manchuria, and they promise they're just peacekeepers. But by 1932, Manchuria has declared its independence, and it's now the separate country of Manchukuo, and the Japanese emperor's cousin is king of it. So it's now a Japanese satellite government. From there, Japan just keeps pushing out further and further and conquering more and more of China. By 1939, Japan controls 25% of China. What's going to happen? The League of Nations. Remember that organization that was there that was founded to prevent ever being a war again? The League of Nations calls Japan, "Send me your ambassador." And they showed up, and the League of Nations votes to condemn their actions. Now they don't have an act of force. They don't send an army in. They don't declare war on Japan. They just go, "Bad boy Japan, don't ever do that again." That's the extent of their power. Because frankly, the only country in the world that's strong enough to go fight them is the United States, and we didn't join the League of Nations. So the League of Nations condemns their actions and orders them to get out of China. And what is Japan going to do? I kid you not, they literally laughed at them. And Japan, on the floor of the chamber of the League of Nations, says, "We quit." And they withdrew from the League of Nations and went home and basically said, "What are you going to do about it?" You know what the world did? Nothing. We didn't do anything because we don't want to go to war again. World War I was terrible. We don't want to do that. So what's the lesson the world's going to learn from this? The lesson is you can go to war, you can invade your neighbor, you can take over your neighbor, and we won't do anything. The League of Nations is a paper tiger. All right, let's look at Italy. Italian incursions. Here is Mussolini, Il Duce. That was his title, the leader. Mussolini and his fascists take over the government, and they do it legally. They're elected as the official government of Italy. And what he does, remember we're in the middle of a depression, is he tells the Italian people, this is scary. He says, you are the descendants of the Romans. And as a result of that, you people, the Italian people, are the rightful rulers of everything that Rome used to own. Well, that's a little bit of land, guys. Rome owned everything in Western Europe, North Africa, all the way through to Turkey and up to England, the British Isles. This is a massive. He says, we should own it all. And the people cheered him because they give him a scapegoat. They give him a reason why you're miserable. He says, you're miserable because they stole our land. They stole our resources. We should go get them. So the very first place he decides to invade is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in Africa, right across from Italy. If you were to look at the boot of Italy, the little tip there, it looks like it's kicking Ethiopia, okay? If you were to go right across. So, 1934, 1935, the Italian Army and Air Force invade Ethiopia. The king of Ethiopia goes to the United Nations and begs for help. He told them, he said, look, we're fighting with everything we have. We have sent our whole Air Force out, both planes, against Italy. I kid you not, they had 2 planes. 2 planes against the Italian Air Force. The Italians have an Air Force, they have tanks, they have machine guns. The Ethiopians have sticks and gardening implements, okay? It is not a fair fight. And he is saying, come help us. The League of Nations condemns him, and just as before, Mussolini just withdraws, leaves, goes home, and says, see what you can do about it. What are you going to do about it? Ethiopia is mine. In Spain, this guy, Francisco Franco, consolidates his power. There's a Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. Italy and Germany were backing the fascists. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviets backed the Republicans. The Republicans won. In this case, we came out okay. Franco emerges as El Caudillo. Now, it's a nationalist government. It has a king, but it is a Republican government with a limited monarchy. By the way, this guy's family still rules Spain today. Franco still ruled Spain in the 1990s. He was still alive. He just passed away in the mid-90s. I got a signed letter from him kicking me out of Spain when I was in Rome. All right, Germany. The big one, the one we're all aware of. Let's talk about German incursions. 1933. Hitler didn't even wait to be told. He just quit the League of Nations before they ever said anything to him. He said, I quit too. My buddy Mussolini quit. My buddy Tojo quit. I'm done. And in 1935, he begins to rebuild the military illegally. Remember, one of the parts of the Versailles Treaty was that they cannot rebuild their military. They cannot have a military, ever. We're supposed to do that. We don't do anything. In 1936, he invades the Rhineland. Now, we can kind of look the other way, because while the Rhineland is in other countries, it's parts that used to be Germany. He's basically invading the parts of Germany that we took away after World War I. And he says, look, I'm just uniting the German people. I'm just taking back what was ours. So we all go, fine, Hitler, keep the Rhineland. That used to be yours anyway. Keep the Rhineland, we don't care. And then in 1937, he signs the Anti-Comintern Pact, where the very first time he used the word Lebensraum. If you ever hear a German say Lebensraum, hold on to everything you own, because they're getting ready to take your land. It means I need living space, living room. What he was saying was, Germany is just too crowded. We need more space, so we need to like take Poland, okay? In 1938, they annexed Austria. Now, we look the other way here too, because there was a vote. The people of Austria voted to become part of the Third Reich. So, okay, we'll look the other way. So now they've added the Rhineland and Austria, and then they invade the Sudetenland. Now, the Sudetenland is a weird spot. It's in the Slavic areas. There was no Slavic country yet, but it's in those areas. But the people do speak German. So should we let Germany have them? I mean, they speak German. They're Germanic people. They eat German foods. Should we let them be part of Germany? Well, maybe, but they don't want to be part of Germany. They want to be their own country. Well, we have a conference here. This is the Munich conference. Neville Chamberlain, the leader of the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, is the person that leads it all. For the U.S., we send Joseph Kennedy, the father of future President John Kennedy. They meet with Hitler, and Hitler says, this is all I want. I'm done. I've got the Sudetenland, I've got Austria, I've got the Rhineland. I'm good. I don't need anything else. So Neville Chamberlain and Kennedy agree to appease him. This policy of appeasement is where you just kind of let them have, we're going to let them have what they want. And he promises he'll never do it again. So much so that Neville Chamberlain comes back to London, gets off his plane with his umbrella, and says, I have met with Hitler. Hitler is a reasonable man, and I have guaranteed us peace in our time. That was in 1938. And in 1939, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, and Poland. Okay? Does that sound very peaceful? No. The Soviets, who were our ally, they make a pact with England and France. They say, look, if the Nazis invade any of these countries, we'll get in. If they go into Lithuania, Poland, Finland, Estonia, or Latvia, that's our sphere of influence, and we'll get in. So that kind of freed England up and France up to do their own thing. The Eastern Front's going to be taken care of by Russia. But secretly, they also signed another treaty with the Nazis called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Non-Aggression Treaty, where they tell the Nazis, look, if you don't attack us, we won't attack you. So they kind of made deals with both sides. So we don't know where the Soviets are going to end up at. All right. I didn't get as far as I wanted to. We are going to have to stop here for the day. There's still at least one more day of lecture for this. So our test is going to be next Wednesday, okay? So we'll still lecture Monday, probably be a short lecture, and I'll hang around to answer questions. Remember, if you've not gotten your study guides done, so you're ready for it, if you've got a question, you can call me, you can text me, you can do whatever you want. I will respond, okay? Feel free to call me or text me. I will see everybody later. I'll hang around for a few minutes if you have any questions.